I got interrupted by a work call. So this now becomes part 1 and part 2 of Adam Goodes. Okay, continuing on. So what about the booing? You know, they said, Stephen Saka said, maybe you're inflaming the crowd and they're having a go at you. And he said, oh, that's right. And he said, in England, if there's racism in the crowd, the two teams walk off. And I thought it was good how Adam Goodes, he said in the interview, no, I wouldn't put that. I wouldn't put that on my team notes or anything like that. He said I'd play the game out, and he said no, with me, no, I don't, the game can. You deal with these things after the game. He said, and anyway, he said, who would you, who's being the racist in the crowd? He actually said this, and it was an amazing comment, really. He said, it's very hard to pick out who's booing because they're a racist and who's booing because I'm a shit bloke. What a great comment, Now, what he meant was, he wasn't necessarily saying that he's a shit bloke, no more than, we all are. Each of us is a shit bloke, or a shit Sheila. I'll take it for what it is. I know what he meant by that. He means in their minds he was thinking you're a shit bloke. So he's woke to that, and that some of the people in the audience, and it becomes a question of how many, and even if a person was booing him, and this would be my personal opinion, if the bloke next to me was going boo you bastard, I would be thinking, and I said, well, why are you doing that? He's a shit bloke, And I said, yeah, but don't boo, don't boo. Like you've been booing for a year and a half. Give it a rest. And then we'd end up in a fight. One of the last times I went to the footy with my brother, we ended up in a fight like that. My brother was jumping up and down. I can't even describe it. I ended up yelling at a fellow Essendon supporter right up in his face, going, no, I won't explain that, but gee, it was a good feeling. My brother and I, shoulder to shoulder, even though it was wrong and we could have been evicted, I was backing my brother and yelling at this bloke in his face, and we could have been evicted easily and perhaps should have been, but gee, it's a good feeling when you're shoulder to shoulder with your brother. That's a whole other story. Anyway, because it was my brother fell over by accident, and rather show any compassion for my brother, this guy said, hey, watch this, look out, look where you nearly hit me, I said, hey, he's just banged his head hard, and I really laid into the guy, and I said a few bad things to him, and it was a fellow Essendon supporter. I didn't care. Anyway, so that's that. It's a good feeling. It's bad and it's good. All right, so anyway, and so Goodsy, he said that, but to a certain extent, no matter why you're booing, number one, I don't boo anyway, for reasons explained in part 1. I don't like booing at all. I really don't. Yeah, that sounds mad, but I don't like it. Just cheer or yell obscenities, one or the other. But the booing, ended up being racist, I think, even if your intention wasn't being racist, because it was the whole crowd booing this guy down here. The effect is racist. It's a little bit like something else Goodsy mentioned, the whole terra nullius. He actually mentioned this, because it's bigger than football, what Goodsy's on about, bigger than football. And he said, it's transcends football, what he went through. And he said it's like this whole terra nullius thing, We were flora and fauna before 50 years ago, when Indigenous people got the vote. And, I was listening, I was saying technically not. Like technically the people who are booing because he's a shit bloke might not be racist, So technically, Indigenous people were never declared flora and fauna, or non-existent or anything like that. I mean, in the early colony, it was murder if you killed an Indigenous person. So they weren't on, it wasn't the same as killing a kangaroo. It was murder. You could hang for it, and people did hang for it. Obviously, there was corrupt judicial processes and all that sort of thing. But the point is, the law was that it was illegal to kill an Aborigine, and and it was called murder. A famous poster by Governor Macquarie, for example, which you can Google yourself. But it was murder, and they were never declared non-existent or anything like that. Terra nullius was a declaration that nobody owned the land, which is a very different thing. But everyone knew they were humans. We started, little English boys were falling in love very quickly with little Indigenous girls, almost immediately. They somehow recognised they were humans. So it wasn't a flora and fauna thing. But however, I'm on Goodsy's side in a way, even though, I disagreed with him on an intellectual level. And this is why I want to see his movie, to feel what he's saying rather than think what he's saying. Because when I think what he's saying, I think you're wrong. It wasn't a declaration that, Terra nullius wasn't a declaration that you were flora and fauna. It was a declaration that no one owned the land. And I won't get into that, We didn't realise the land owned the Indigenous people, and it was, it's a whole big thing, We got that wrong. Okay. Now, but it may as well have been. Effectively, they were relegated, Indigenous people were relegated to the status of flora and fauna on their own land, as it were. So I'm with him on that. I think he's wrong intellectually, but in terms of how the effect, it was effectively a declaration of flora and fauna. It's like the White Australia policy. It wasn't really about skin colour. It was about living conditions and wages and all that sort of stuff. And we didn't want Chinese people flooding in here, which we still apparently don't to this day. We've still got a White Australia policy in place because we're worried about being swamped by Chinese. It's always been about Chinese people in Australia, mostly. It was never about Africans. We haven't got a history with Africans in Australia until very recently, but they're just an absolute minority. It's all about Chinese normally, and that's what it was like. And the White Australia policy wasn't about just pure race, skin colour, but it had that. It wasn't not about that either. It was like a European Australian policy, and it was called a White Australia policy because, look, the people at the time, our founding bastards, looked around the world and they said, all the countries that have white-skinned people have good living conditions. They didn't join the dots quite properly, and high wages and all that sort of thing. We don't want to wreck that. And if we let people from other races in, and they were right. If Chinese people had flooded in, because we hated them anyway because of the gold rush and all that sort of stuff, didn't want to share. He's right. We wouldn't have the cute little towns we've got these days. We'd have something that looks more like Hong Kong all over the joint, and we're getting there anyway. But that doesn't matter. All that sort of stuff. But White Australia policy wasn't just a declaration of we like white people, and it was trying to protect English living conditions, English Anglo style living conditions. All right. And not have, Middle Eastern style bazaars everywhere, crowded bazaars with, things, you walk down a crowded bazaar and all that sort of stuff, and haggle, blah, blah, blah. You want to buy this, and all that sort of stuff. We didn't want all that. And we didn't want all the kind of swarms of people in a Chinese sense and all that sort of stuff. And, we were happy to have a Chinatown, but we didn't want the whole of Australia to be like that. It was more like that. That's what the White Australia policy is. But it ended up an evil thing. This is the thing. It ended up an evil thing. But, Australia, as we know it, wouldn't exist. Had we not put the White Australia policy in, probably. It would have looked a lot more like it would have been lowest common denominator across the world in terms of people willing to work for next to nothing and living like crap, back then at least, probably. And that was underpinned the White Australia policy. But at the same time as the White Australia policy, we for the first time in the history of the planet, you had a country, and that's ours. At the same time as something evil like the White Australia policy, you had something glorious at the same time that was full political rights for women. We were the first country. New Zealand and Australia are pretty much the same country, you know. And New Zealand, first country in the world ever to give women the vote, and Australia, the first country in the world. We got that from South Australia. You know, we inherited that from South Australia upon federation. Full political rights for women. Now we didn't carry through and actually let them be prime minister, but the law was there. It doesn't. Yeah, obviously. You know, like, it wasn't murder. I mean, it was murder if you killed an Indigenous person, but a lot of people got off that shouldn't have, but that was a corrupt judicial process. But the law itself wasn't, you know, you are flora and fauna. You know, this sort of thing, it's what you're saying and then what you're doing. You know, it's like the English invented abolition of slavery sort of thing, along with, you know, the Europeans. But then they didn't follow through and make the world fair. In fact, they rigged the world to their own advantage. So, you know, they said all the nice words, you know, we'll invent non-slavery, you know, for the first time in absolute history on any land, except for hunter-gatherer mobs and stuff who didn't even need slavery, and so on and so forth. Now, and this thing where you're technically wrong, maybe, goodsy, you know, in my mind, you know, and yet I get it, because the effect of what you're saying. You know, he said on another occasion, New Zealand, in that same interview, New Zealand is light years, because Stephen Sackur asked him what would make it better. And he said, oh, it's simple. New Zealand is light years ahead of Australia because they've got a treaty with the Maoris, and we haven't in Australia. It's that simple, you know. New Zealand is light years ahead of us. And I thought, that's a really good point. I said, yeah, that doesn't make the New Zealand, you know, people at the time any nicer than us, the ones who struck the treaty. It was only because the Maoris forced those people. They were us. New Zealand and Australia were the same country. New Zealand was inside New South Wales, where Adam Goodes was speaking from to Stephen Sackur. So New South Wales was that area there, plus New Zealand. It was all the same colony. You know, so New Zealand isn't different from Australia, but why did they get a treaty and Indigenous Australians didn't? Because in those days, you didn't sign it. You're an idiot if you sign a treaty unless you're forced to. And the Maoris kind of forced the New Zealanders to. And that's probably because Indigenous people are nicer than Maoris. Yeah. And to a certain extent, we in New Zealand, who were forced to the treaty table by the Maoris, that's because the Maoris were a bit like us. Google Chatham Islands and what the Maoris did to Chatham Islands. They colonised it and enslaved all the people and all that sort of stuff. The Maori people were a lot like the British people, but they didn't get to do it on a global scale, but they did it in Chatham Islands. Whereas I don't think culturally Indigenous people are really like that. There was a group of English people that got shipwrecked down in Victoria really early in the piece, and they had to walk to Sydney. And they met tribe, mob after mob after mob, and there was only one warlike mob amongst, you know, everyone they met was friendly. You know, the Sailors' Walk, they call it. And they walked from Victoria, before Melbourne was even settled, all the way up there to New South Wales, and they said mob after mob was helping them all along the way. It was a wonderful experience. There was one mob on the way that was warlike and said, get off our sort of land, our hunting lands, and all that sort of stuff. But that's different than the Maoris, you know. Now, the Maoris, if they had have been in the same situation as England, I think they would have been just like the English, because just Google what they did to the people of Chatham Island, who are actually their long-lost cousins. You know, as soon as the English discovered the Chatham Islands existed, the Maoris got, what? We didn't even know it was there, and it's not that far from New Zealand. And they actually commandeered a British ship by force. That's how strong the Maoris were. And they commandeered it, you know, and forced the English to go over there. And then slaughtered as many people as they could and enslaved the rest, and it was absolutely horrendous. They did a Spain, the Maoris did, on Chatham Islands. It was amazing. And this is why they got a treaty. You know, and Goodsey was saying New Zealand is light years ahead of Australia because he almost made it sound like the New Zealanders were willing to do a treaty with the Maoris, but they were forced to. Now, what we have to do is become bigger people in Australia and make a treaty, perhaps, not because we were forced to, but be the first country ever to make a treaty because we should, you know, because we're bigger and better, we're evolved, you know. So, you know, Adam Goodes almost sound like, you know, New Zealand's a pin-up country, but they're a pack of miserable assholes just like us, absolutely. But, you know, they were forced to the treaty table. And the Indigenous people didn't force Australians, you know, European Australians, because Australians, it's kind of nation state of Australia, so that means European Australians, when you say Australians, often. With the Indigenous mobs, you know, it's Wurundjeri or whatever, you know. And that's that. But anyway, look, I'll finish off because I've got to get back to work. And, yeah, I might have a look at these film, but if I do, it'll be the first time I've watched any film. Look, I probably won't get around to it, but I really want to. Not because I want to learn anything especially, but I want to feel something, which is a type of learning anyway, I think. End of episode.